Los Angeles protests against ICE surge, over 2,000 demonstrators rally for immigrant rights. Date, June 10, 2025. In a significant display of dissent, over 2,000 demonstrators took to the streets of Los Angeles in a concerted effort to protest against U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) and the Trump administration's aggressive immigration policies. These protests, which began in early June, have escalated into a national movement advocating for immigrant rights and calling for the end of ICE raids. Background: the protests were ignited on June 5, 2025, when a series of workplace immigration raids were conducted in Los Angeles. Activists viewed these actions as part of a broader campaign by the Trump administration to enforce draconian immigration policies, prompting immediate backlash from various community groups and labor unions. Key events in the protests. June 5, 2025, activists organized a rally in response to the immigration raids. The demonstrators condemned the raids as unjust and harmful to immigrant communities. June 7, 2025, David Huerta, president of the Service Employees International Union SEIU of California, was arrested during a demonstration. His detention served as a rallying point, galvanizing labor support and prompting further protests not only in Los Angeles but across the country. June 8 to 9, 2025, protests intensified, leading to confrontations between demonstrators and law enforcement. Police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse crowds that engaged in vandalism and blockaded traffic. Reports indicate that over 150 people were arrested during these clashes. June 9, 2025, in response to the escalating protests, President Trump authorized the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles, bypassing California Governor Gavin Newsom. This move was met with fierce criticism, with Newsom labeling it a violation of state sovereignty and indicating plans to challenge it legally. June 10, 2025, protests began to spread to other major cities across the United States, including San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Atlanta. Activists organized demonstrations under the banner of No Kings, which aimed to resist ICE's tactics while calling for Huerta's release. Nationwide movement. The protests in Los Angeles are part of a larger national backlash against ICE's immigration enforcement policies. Demonstrations were reported in at least 25 other locations across the United States, highlighting a significant mobilization of public sentiment against federal immigration actions. Labor unions, particularly the SEIU, played a crucial role in this movement. The arrest of Huerta not only galvanized support from organized labor but also emphasized the intersection of labor rights and immigrant rights. Union members participated in rallies, underscoring the shared struggles of workers and immigrants. Government response and criticism. The deployment of National Guard troops to Los Angeles drew considerable criticism from state officials and civil rights advocates. Many viewed it as an overreach of federal power, with Trump characterizing the protests as insurrectionist. This rhetoric further polarized the discourse surrounding immigration enforcement and the protests. Protest experiences varied widely, with many demonstrations remaining peaceful while others turned confrontational. Reports indicated a mix of participation levels. Some protests drew thousands while others attracted only a few dozen. Coverage from various sources. NBC News emphasized the peaceful nature of many protests while acknowledging instances of vandalism and clashes, and reported the significant participation of trade unionists advocating for Huerta's release. Time magazine highlighted the rapid spread of protests in major cities and the growing backlash to the Trump administration's immigration enforcement tactics, noting that at least 30 new protests were planned. Access to Los Angeles Times was denied, but it is likely that this source provided localized insights into the developments within California, focusing on the impact of the protests in the city. Summary. The Los Angeles protests against ICE represent a significant national movement advocating for immigrant rights and showcasing deep societal divisions over immigration enforcement policies. The situation continues to evolve with further demonstrations anticipated as activists rally for justice and solidarity across the country. The unprecedented mobilization reflects widespread discontent with the current administration's approach to immigration and highlights the urgent need for reform in federal immigration policies. As the protests develop, the voices calling for justice and respect for immigrant communities resonate across the nation, signaling a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle for immigrant rights in the United States. The Los Angeles protests against ICE have sparked significant national discourse and mobilization around immigrant rights, revealing several counterintuitive aspects about the events and the reactions they have provoked. 1. Peaceful protests amid aggression. While reports indicate that many protests were peaceful, the narrative often highlights the confrontational aspects such as clashes with police and instances of vandalism. This juxtaposition creates a counterintuitive image where the underlying message of peaceful assembly for immigrant rights is overshadowed by episodes of violence, thereby complicating public perception of the movement's legitimacy. 2. National Guard deployment backfires. The decision by President Trump to deploy 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles intended to quell the protests has instead galvanized further demonstrations across the country. This deployment is seen as an overreach of federal power that has united diverse groups, labor unions, civil rights organizations, and immigrant advocacy groups against a common adversary, thus expanding the movement rather than suppressing it. 3. Labor's role in the movement. The arrest of David Huerta, a prominent labor leader, unexpectedly served as a rallying point that intensified labor participation in the protests. Initially, labor unions may not have been directly involved in immigrant rights activism. However, Huerta's arrest has blurred the lines between labor rights and immigrant rights, highlighting a counterintuitive alliance formed under the pressure of federal enforcement actions. 4. Perception of protesters. Trump's labeling of protesters as insurrectionists and the characterization of their actions as violent have created a stark dichotomy. This rhetoric could alienate potential supporters who view the protests as legitimate expressions of dissent against unjust policies. The counterintuitive outcome here is that by using extreme language, the administration may inadvertently strengthen solidarity among protesters and sympathizers who feel their rights are being threatened. 5. Diverse participation. Reports indicate that participation in the protests varied significantly across different locations, with some cities experiencing thousands of demonstrators while others had only a few dozen participants. This disparity suggests a counterintuitive understanding of grassroots mobilization. It highlights that even a small number of dedicated activists can spark widespread national interest and action, influencing events in larger cities. 6. Impact of social media. The rapid organization of protests through social media platforms like X, formerly Twitter, demonstrates the counterintuitive power of digital communication. While one might expect that traditional forms of organization would dominate, it is evident that online platforms have become crucial for rallying support and disseminating information quickly, allowing for spontaneous protests to emerge in cities across the nation. 7. Public sentiment. The protests reflect a broader public sentiment against federal immigration enforcement policies, which may not be as universally accepted as the administration assumes. The counterintuitive aspect here is the potential for a seemingly polarized issue, immigration enforcement, to unify various demographic groups, including labor, immigrant communities, and civil rights advocates, against a shared cause. 8. Legal challenges to federal power. California's legal response to the National Guard deployment, arguing it violates state sovereignty, reveals a counterintuitive dynamic where state and federal tensions can lead to increased activism and mobilization at the state level, rather than quelling dissent. Legal challenges may invigorate local movements and foster a sense of agency among residents who feel directly impacted by federal policies. 9. Vandalism and its implications. The presence of vandalism and violent actions during protests is often used to discredit movements. However, these actions can paradoxically bring more media attention and public discourse to the cause, focusing attention on the underlying issues of immigration policy and enforcement. This counterintuitive effect can sometimes overshadow the intended messages of peaceful protesters advocating for immigrant rights. 10. Future protests and momentum. The ongoing protests and their spread to other cities indicate that rather than diminishing, the momentum for immigrant rights is continuing to build, contrary to expectations that federal crackdowns would suppress dissent. This suggests a counterintuitive resilience among activists who find strength in adversity, as well as a growing recognition of the importance of immigrant rights as a critical social justice issue. In conclusion, the Los Angeles protests against ICE illustrate several counterintuitive dynamics regarding public dissent, federal responses, and the evolving dialogue surrounding immigration and labor rights. The events signify not only a reaction to specific policies but also a broader movement that challenges the status quo, revealing deeper societal divisions and the potential for alliances among various advocacy groups. As the situation evolves, these counterintuitive elements will likely continue to shape the national conversation on immigration and civil rights. In the report on the recent protests against ICE U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in Los Angeles, there are several significant aspects that many readers may overlook, yet these elements are critical to understanding the broader implications of the protests and the national immigration debate. Here are some key points that warrant further exploration. 1. The role of labor unions. Significance. The involvement of labor unions, particularly the Service Employees International Union SEIU, is a pivotal aspect of the protests that may not receive adequate attention. The arrest of SEIU California President David Huerta acted as a catalyst for mobilization, demonstrating the intersection of labor rights and immigrant rights. Unions like the SEIU have historically played a significant role in advocating for marginalized communities, and their participation signals a unified front in the fight for social justice. Implication: this collaboration between labor and immigrant rights advocates could lead to a more robust movement, as both groups face similar challenges in terms of worker rights and protections. The support of organized labor provides resources, visibility, and legitimacy to the cause, potentially transforming the protests into a more sustained and organized national movement. 2. The National Guard deployment. Significance: President Trump's decision to deploy 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles was not just a response to the protests but also an escalation of federal authority over state matters. This move, which bypassed California Governor Gavin Newsom, raises critical questions about state sovereignty and the balance of power between state and federal governments. Implication: the deployment of military forces in response to civilian protests can set a troubling precedent for future government responses to dissent. It highlights a growing militarization of domestic policing and could lead to increased tensions between federal and state authorities, possibly igniting further protests and legal battles over the use of state resources against citizens exercising their constitutional rights. 3. The nature of the protests. Significance: while many mainstream narratives focus on the confrontational aspects of the protests, such as clashes with law enforcement and instances of vandalism, it is essential to recognize the broader context of these actions. The protests were largely driven by deep-seated frustrations regarding immigration policies and the treatment of undocumented immigrants. Implication: understanding the motivations behind the protests can foster a more empathetic view of the actions taken by demonstrators. Viewing these protests through the lens of desperation and a fight for justice can help shift the narrative from one of chaos to one of civil rights activism. This perspective can encourage more constructive dialogues about immigration policies and reform. 4. National scope of the protests. Significance: the protests in Los Angeles have sparked demonstrations in at least 25 other cities across the United States, indicating a significant national backlash against ICE's immigration enforcement policies. This widespread mobilization suggests that the issues at hand resonate with a broader segment of the population beyond just those directly affected by immigration laws. Implication: the national scale of the protests suggests a growing movement that could influence electoral politics, public policy, and community organizing efforts. As more people engage in the conversation around immigration rights, it could lead to shifts in public opinion and increased pressure on lawmakers to address these issues comprehensively. 5. The political rhetoric. Significance: the rhetoric employed by President Trump and his administration labeling protesters as insurrectionists and professional agitators is significant as it shapes public perception and discourse surrounding the protests. Such language can delegitimize the grievances of protesters and frame the conflict in a manner that justifies aggressive law enforcement responses. Implication: this framing can polarize public opinion and may deter moderate voices from joining the movement. It creates an us versus them mentality which can escalate tensions and hinder constructive conversations about immigration reform. Understanding the impact of political rhetoric is crucial for activists seeking to broaden their appeal and cultivate a more inclusive movement. 6. Local versus national media coverage. Significance: the differences in media coverage between national outlets like NBC News and Time versus local coverage, which is less accessible in this case, can shape public understanding of the events. National outlets may focus on the dramatic aspects of the protests, while local coverage may provide more nuanced insights into community perspectives and the specific challenges faced in Los Angeles. Implication: this disparity in coverage can lead to a fragmented understanding of the protests. National narratives may overlook the unique local contexts that drive the protests, potentially marginalizing the voices of those directly affected by ICE's policies. For activists, ensuring that local perspectives are represented in the broader narrative is crucial for fostering solidarity and understanding. 7. Legal challenges and state sovereignty. Significance: California's response to the National Guard deployment, including plans to challenge it, legally underscores the tensions between state and federal authorities. The legal ramifications of this confrontation can have long-term implications for how states navigate federal immigration policies. Implication: legal battles over state sovereignty and federal overreach can set important precedents for future governance. If California successfully challenges the deployment, it could embolden other states to assert their rights and resist federal mandates, potentially leading to a patchwork of immigration policies across the country. Conclusion: the protests against ICE in Los Angeles represent a significant moment in the ongoing struggle for immigrant rights and social justice in the United States. By recognizing the overlooked aspects of these events, such as the involvement of labor unions, the implications of government responses, and the broader national context, we can better understand the complexities of the situation. It is essential for advocates and observers alike to engage with these dimensions to foster a more informed and constructive dialogue around immigration policies and civil rights. The Los Angeles protests against ICE that erupted in early June 2025 provide a rich tapestry of social, political, and economic themes worth analyzing. Here are 4 key points for in-depth discussion. 1. Nationwide movement and mobilization of public sentiment. The protests in Los Angeles are symptomatic of a broader national movement against ICE's immigration enforcement policies. This grassroots mobilization, with demonstrations occurring in over 25 cities, reflects a significant shift in public sentiment concerning immigration practices. The protests emphasized the growing frustration among communities regarding perceived injustices in immigration enforcement, particularly those targeting vulnerable populations. Discussion points: what factors have contributed to the rise in organized protests against ICE? How do public perceptions of immigration and immigrant rights evolve in response to government actions? In what ways do these protests reflect broader societal divisions regarding immigration policy? 2. Intersection of labor rights and immigrant rights. The involvement of labor unions, particularly the Service Employees International Union SEIU, highlights the intersectionality between labor rights and immigrant rights. The arrest of SEIU President David Huerta galvanized union support for the protests, underscoring the vital role that organized labor plays in advocating for immigrant communities. This convergence of interests indicates a strategic alliance that could redefine labor activism in the context of immigration. Discussion points: How can labor unions effectively advocate for immigrant rights? What role do unions play in shaping public discourse around immigration issues? How might the labor movement evolve in response to immigration enforcement tactics? 3. Government response and federal-state tensions. The deployment of National Guard troops by President Trump without the consent of California Governor Gavin Newsom highlights a contentious power struggle between federal and state authorities. This action was criticized as an overreach of federal power and raised questions about state sovereignty. The differing narratives from government officials and civil rights advocates further polarize public opinion. Discussion points. How does the deployment of National Guard troops impact perceptions of state versus federal authority in the U.S.? What are the implications of federal actions on state rights, particularly in traditionally liberal states like California? How do such tensions shape the future landscape of civil rights and public safety? 4. Varied experiences and narratives of protest. The protests varied significantly in terms of their nature and outcomes. While many demonstrations were peaceful, instances of violence and vandalism received significant media attention, influencing public perception of the movement. The differential reporting from various news sources highlighting different aspects of the protests indicates how narratives can shape public understanding and response. Discussion points. How do media narratives influence public perceptions of protests and the issues they address? In what ways do the experiences of peaceful versus confrontational protests impact the overall movement? What are the consequences of framing protests as either legitimate expressions of dissent or as acts of violence? In summary, the Los Angeles protests against ICE serve as a focal point for discussing broader trends in social activism. The intersection of labor and immigrant rights, the dynamics of federal versus state authority, and the role of media in shaping public discourse. These points provide a robust framework for analyzing the implications of the protests on future movements and policy changes. 1. Stonewall Riots 1969. The Stonewall Riots were a series of spontaneous demonstrations by members of the LGBTQ+ community against a police raid at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The riots began on June 28, 1969, when patrons of the bar fought back against police harassment and discrimination. The event is widely regarded as a catalyst for the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement, leading to the formation of various advocacy groups and the annual Pride parades celebrated worldwide. The protests against police actions akin to the Los Angeles protests against ICE highlight the struggle for rights and equality. 2. The Civil Rights Movement 1950s to 1960s. The civil rights movement in the United States involved mass protests against racial segregation and discrimination. Key events included the Montgomery bus boycott 1955 to 1956, the March on Washington 1963, and the Selma to Montgomery marches 1965. Activists including Martin Luther King Jr. organized peaceful protests and were met with violence from law enforcement similar to the confrontations seen in Los Angeles. The movement ultimately led to significant legislative changes, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, reflecting the power of collective action against perceived injustices. 3. Anti-Vietnam War protests 1960s to 1970s. The protests against the Vietnam War grew throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, driven by opposition to U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. Demonstrations such as the Kent State University protests in May 1970, where 4 students were killed by the National Guard during a protest, highlighted the tensions between government authority and public dissent. These protests mobilized large segments of the population and were marked by significant clashes with law enforcement, paralleling the current protests against ICE in Los Angeles. The anti-war movement was instrumental in shaping public opinion and policy regarding U.S. military actions abroad. The recent protests in Los Angeles against ICE have sparked significant national discourse on immigration policies and civil rights. As we look ahead, several predictions can be made regarding the future of this movement, the potential for continued unrest, and the broader implications for immigration policy and social justice in the United States. 1. Continued mobilization and growth of the movement. The protests in Los Angeles have ignited a nationwide backlash against ICE's enforcement tactics, with demonstrations already reported in multiple major cities. This mobilization is likely to continue as activists and organizations rally around the cause of immigrant rights. The involvement of well-established labor unions such as SEIU signifies a strong coalition forming between labor rights and immigrant rights advocates. We can anticipate that this coalition will amplify its efforts, leading to more organized and larger demonstrations across the country. 2. Political ramifications. The political landscape is set to shift in response to these protests. As local and state officials, particularly in Democratic strongholds, respond to federal actions, we may see increased tension between state governments and the federal administration. Lawsuits challenging the deployment of National Guard troops and other federal interventions are likely, which could lead to significant court battles over state sovereignty and federal authority. Moreover, as the 2026 elections approach, candidates will likely have to address immigration reform and the rights of undocumented individuals as critical issues. The protests may serve as a catalyst for more progressive immigration policies, influencing campaign platforms and legislative agendas. 3. Increased polarization. The protests are indicative of a broader societal divide regarding immigration and law enforcement. As rhetoric escalates, with federal officials labeling protesters as insurrectionists, we can expect further polarization within the electorate. This division may manifest in heightened confrontations between protesters and law enforcement, as well as between different community groups. The potential for violent clashes could increase if both sides remain entrenched in their positions. 4. Policy changes and legislative action. In response to the mounting pressure from activists and constituents, there is potential for legislative action at both state and federal levels. Lawmakers may introduce bills aimed at reforming ICE practices, increasing protections for undocumented individuals, or limiting the power of federal immigration enforcement. On the other hand, hardline immigration policies may also be reinforced by those who view the protests as a threat to public safety. 5. Impact on public opinion. Public sentiment regarding immigration and ICE is likely to evolve as a result of these protests. As media coverage continues to highlight the human stories behind the protests, there may be a shift in public opinion towards a more empathetic view of immigrants and their struggles. Grassroots campaigns and social media advocacy could play a significant role in shaping narratives and influencing perceptions. 6. Long-term changes in immigration policy. Looking further ahead, the sustained protests and advocacy may contribute to long-term changes in U.S. immigration policy. With the ongoing discussions about comprehensive immigration reform, there is potential for new pathways to citizenship for undocumented individuals, adjustments to enforcement practices, and a re-evaluation of the broader immigration system. 7. Increased grassroots activism and community organizing. The current wave of protests may inspire a new generation of grassroots activism focused on immigrant rights and social justice. Local organizations could see increased membership and support, leading to strengthened community ties and more robust advocacy networks. This grassroots movement may extend to other social justice issues, creating a multifaceted approach to activism that addresses intersecting inequalities. 8. Technological and social media influence. Social media will continue to play a crucial role in organizing protests and disseminating information. Activists will likely leverage platforms to coordinate events, share experiences, and mobilize support across geographic boundaries. The ability to quickly organize and spread messages will enhance the movement's reach and effectiveness. Conclusion. The future outlook for the protests against ICE and the broader movement for immigrant rights in the U.S. is one of potential growth, conflict, and change. As the situation unfolds, we can expect ongoing demonstrations, increased political engagement, and a continued push for policy reforms. The intersection of labor rights and immigrant rights will likely strengthen the movement, while the response from the federal government will shape the trajectory of public discourse and activism. The path ahead is fraught with challenges, but it also presents opportunities for meaningful change in the fight for justice and equity in immigration policy.